Hi everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Cassandra's Box. Today I'm going to be talking about mass psychosis, transphobia, and the men's sexual rights movement. I think it's important to understand kind of what's going on here. And I've been talking a lot about mental illness because I think mental illness has so much to do with what's going on here. Both with, the people in power that are pushing this, although, again, that's something that's a little bit more planned or calculated to talk about at another time. And I'm more interested in why are all the foot soldiers of the trans movement, why are they picking up this fight, right? Who are these people? And then another thing is, why are all the rest of the people on the liberal left, why are they supporting them? So what's going on there? So I'm kind of interested not just in people's individual mental illnesses and the way that they act. I'm also interested in the way that the rest of society, which I kind of made a case that we live in a mentally ill society. A lot of, deep green ecologists have made that case. And so have a lot of people that so have a lot of sociologists and psychologists have made, I think, a really good case that we live in a society that is itself pathological in quite a few ways. Is it necessary? And I'm going to do another, I already have a whole bunch of these sketched out, or at least, plans for what to talk about. And I'm definitely going to be doing another one about dissociation from the body and capitalism, and Descartes and Thomas Hobbes, and how this transhumanism is, just the logical outcome, the logical endpoint of this kind of thinking. So it's really not surprising. This whole movement is a cover for, essentially, it was thought, and I think in a way that's rather cynical, that it would be easier to get people to get rid of the idea of sex because they don't think women are important, and because essentially the misogyny of that, it's not even that they're justifying that this is going to actually lead to liberation. It's more like they don't care. So that would be an easier sell than things that would affect the actual humans, right? I mean, just like there was a shorthand term for the police when women in prostitution were killed, no humans involved. They essentially, women, and this is the uncomfortable truth, and this is, again, this is coming from somebody who, am part of this subclass of women, which is why I'll never see justice, and yet I'm outside of it because I have been protected in some ways by, I'm definitely going to say it's by my background, and skin color and other privileges that I had, that I've been able to have the wherewithal that most people do not, coming from, my level of education and family background, to kind of, despite ended up, being kind of cannon fodder for the pathology of our society, despite being abused over and over again, I've been able to sort of get out of it. And there are remarkable cases of women that don't have, that all they have is their own innate brilliance, and everything else is stacked against them, and they've been able to get out of that, out of this as well. So I think consciousness raising is going to be very, very important here. But yes, the reason I have so much sympathy for these women that are at the front lines of the war on women here is because, again, for by the grace of God go I really, really, really empathize with these women. Had I not been born to my particular lucky, fortunate circumstances, and I had only had my unfortunate circumstances compounded by, being black, being poor, and so on, I could very well have seen myself getting criminalized and ending up in some place like a prison, where over half of women have experienced child sexual abuse and rape, and domestic violence, and a huge number of women there are just really, really traumatized. A huge number of women there are there because they killed violent men, or because they attempted to kill violent men. A huge number of women are there because they were involved with violent men. And they ended up being implicated in these men's behavior. Some of them actually did participate. There's also the fact that women are more criminalized and impoverished. Again, so there's a lot of reasons that women go to prison having to do with their involvement with men, and a lot of reasons that women go to prison having to do with the fact that they are impoverished. But the vast majority of women in prison, I didn't even realize this until recently, are victims, and that makes it even more of an outrage that we are now foisting these sexual predators upon them. And this is not to say that there's not a lot of men in prison that are victims. I think that there are, particularly those that are impoverished and racialized, that are there for petty crimes, or that could be rehabilitated, and that their issues with the law have to do with the way that they have been disenfranchised, and the way that they grew up as a result of poverty and racism. However, there are also a lot of men that are just extremely violent in male prison. Again, so there's a difference there. This is why this issue matters to me, as somebody who comes from this kind of underclass. And the thing is that as long as we as women tolerate there being an underclass of women who are designated the abused, and we allow that to be okay, we are all fair targets. And the moment it's no longer convenient to pretend like the rest of us are human beings, we will all belong to that subclass. All of us. And that's what's happening right now. And that's why it's important. It's important that all women care about what happens to the women that are funneled into prostitution. And all women care about what happens to the women that are funneled into prison. And all women care about what happens to the women that end up homeless because of mental illness and abuse and violence. We have to all care about this because it could be any of us at any moment. It doesn't matter how careful we are and how carefully we choose our steps in life. It could be any of us at any moment, and we're seeing this happen right now. And those of us who have experienced injustice in our lives and who have our eyes open about what's going on with liberal feminism and with the extreme misogyny on the left are aware of this. We are, we're the frogs or the bees of the ecosystem. We're the first ones affected, and we're the most aware. And then women who work on the front lines. And I have so much respect for the women who choose to work on the front lines, rather than like me simply coming from that demographic that needs to be helped by the women who work in domestic violence shelters and rape crisis shelters, and who work with the mentally ill. I have nothing but, I have also done this myself, but I couldn't at this point. I have worked with mentally ill women and with developmentally disabled women, but I have never, worked in a domestic violence or rape crisis shelter, and I think I would need to do a good bit more healing before I could do that. And I have nothing but tremendous, tremendous respect for those women, and those women who have dedicated their lives to these causes just to help other women are also the most aware of what is going on. So I want to talk a little bit about what is going on today. Okay, so there's a couple of things to go over here. First of all, I want to talk over what is mass psychosis. Let's talk about that a little bit. What is mass hysteria? It's also called mass psychogenic illness. It goes all the way through history, and it's everything from outbreaks of laughter. For example, there was the Tanganyika laughter epidemic in 1962. Began on January 13th, 1962 at a mission-run boarding school for girls in Kashasha, Tanzania. The laughter started with 3 girls and spread haphazardly throughout the school, affecting 95 of the 159 pupils aged 12 to 18. Symptoms lasted from a few hours to 16 days in those affected. The teaching staff were not affected, but reported that students were unable to concentrate on their lessons. The school was forced to close down on March 18, 1962. After the school was closed and the students were sent home, the epidemic spread to Nshamba, a village that was home to several of the girls. In April and May, 217 people had laughing attacks in the village, most of them school children and young adults. The Kashasha school was reopened on May 21st, only to be closed again at the end of June. In June, the laughing epidemic spread to the Ramashenye Girls' Middle School near Bukoba, affecting 48 girls. Another outbreak occurred in Kanyangareka, and 2 nearby boys' schools were closed. This is really, really important when talking about the way that this has taken off as a trend and rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is experienced by groups of young girls who transition together. And I think that people have talked about mirror neurons and what they mean, and how they play a role in groupthink and in mass hysteria. And again, it's interesting to me to try to understand psychology in this regard. For example, Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. I actually do believe in the collective unconscious, and to me, the collective unconscious is how we are kind of invisibly emotionally attuned to each other. And again, this is, I think, why we can. This is one way in which we are a hive mind, and we can see this through the internet as well. The internet constitutes essentially. And again, that's interesting to me in looking at Freud's ideas of the id, the ego, and the super ego, because the internet just started out as a mass representation of our id. People just saying things anonymously that they could not say, and there's a huge influence for me on that. The fact that what we consider to be shameful things the ways that we couldn't speak to others, have now entered popular discourse. And we say it to each other's faces, or we say it when we have blue check accounts that have our identities linked to them. And we used to, these things that we used to only say anonymously, that in many ways represented the worst sides of ourselves. And I would say that capitalism capitalized on the worst sides of ourselves, right? That's why really it's a cold calculus. I don't think it's any kind of conspiracy about hating women. I think it's just tapped into a pre-existing misogyny, which is an untapped market, or was an untapped market that just went viral. And it is like a virus. It's overtaking our societies. But pornography used to be something that men did and didn't talk about. And then there was this whole renaissance, which to me always just makes me kind of, I can't help but just have the most massive eye roll ever when I hear this idea of the sexual renaissance, as if this hasn't happened so many times over, as if this is not cyclical, and as if this doesn't happen every 50 years or so. It's just ridiculous to me. This was nothing, the free love movement didn't reinvent it. Sex positivity movement, the trans movement did not reinvent it any more than the flappers reinvented it. I mean, this goes back a long, long way. My God. These different ideas about sexuality and what group sexuality is, go back to the beginning of civilization, which civilization only means civification. So it goes back to the beginning of large groups of people living together. It goes back to then. That's why you had Saturnalias and Bacchanalias back in the, in the Roman and ancient Greek days. I mean, the origins of Valentine's Day are young men and women going to a huge orgy, essentially, where they slaughtered goats and sheep and painted themselves with the blood, or even strapped dead animals to their bodies, and then danced in a frenzy all night long, drinking wine and coupled randomly with different people, resulting in pregnancies, which in a celebration of the spring. I mean, this has been different ideas about sexuality, some which seem to us to be very extreme nowadays, have been around for a very long time. This is nothing new. No one is inventing anything new. But in any case, there's been an argument about, and I'm going to definitely do a segment on sexuality. But there's been an argument about what constitutes healthy sexuality, and about whether or not your sexuality should be the business of the community, of the larger community, for a very, very long time. That's been going on for a long time. So, and it goes in cycles. And these cycles, it doesn't matter whether they're religious in nature or not. We like to be fairly ahistorical and pretend that this argument wasn't going on before the Puritans existed, but it was. And again, at some point, I'm going to do a segment about Sylvia Federici and her groundbreaking work about the witch trials, and what that had to do with capitalism, and what that had to do with sexuality, and what that had to do with was essentially the official, the reification of gender roles, their codification in law, and the whole cloth invention of some new gender roles. I would say that essentially that was making them official, into no longer being meta messages, but making them official. And since then, we've continued to recreate and reproduce those since then. And the truth is that queer theory is nothing more than more reproduction of these roles. And that is why it's so disingenuous and nothing else. It's intellectually disingenuous because we are simply reproducing these roles that have been going on for a very long time. You're not queering damn shit. I know that I'm ranting right now, but I just can't be nice about this anymore. We have to teach people actual history, interesting history, that makes people uncomfortable. Not all these dry, boring, stupid facts that represent the winners in history, that represent no actual critical thinking or arguments about history, or an understanding of the role of oppression in history. It drives me up the fucking wall. In any case, moving on. So this whole thing of the free love in the 60s and 70s, this was happening to my aunt, and it was very sad to see her talk about this with no awareness, or in a way that was just obviously she was very uncomfortable about this, but was defending it. And this is the seeds of liberal feminism and the seeds of what's happening now. She's perfectly open to... It's funny, I tried to discuss with her how this is incredibly misogynistic of a time we are in right now, because of my life, which again I haven't talked to my family about, and my repeated experiences of rape, and how common this is for women who are dating. Just go and look at female dating strategy. They talk about trying to date men under 35, and how essentially they've been ruined by pornography, and turned into dangerous partner rapists, essentially. First thing when I went to therapy and discussed what had happened to me, that my therapist asked was, what kind of porn did he watch? Of course, because she could tell that this was a script taken from porn. In fact, in categories of rapists, there are categories of rapists: power rapists, anger rapists, obsessive rapists, and sadistic rapists. Power rapists essentially oftentimes thought that rape was love, and they have a kind of delusion that they are in love with the victim, and that the victim loves them back, and that it's a way of them feeling power, and so on. And so stranger rapers that are power rapists, for example, may even send the victim flowers afterwards, or say that they say I love you while they're doing it, and so on. This is a way for them to feel power, and it's fueling a fantasy. And anger rapists are doing it out of an anger at women, essentially, the type of revenge. Obsessive rapist was very interesting to me because it was generally partner and acquaintance and date rape, or partner and date rape, I'd say especially. And it specifically is about forcing things that women say no to. So it's not about men who can't get sex, which again is most rapists, and I'm going to do at some point a segment dispelling rape myths, but most rapists are sexual narcissists. So actually they've had more partners than other men, and most of those partners are consensual partners. Or, knowing how these men operate, there's probably a lot of coercion going on as well. But they've had a lot more partners than your average man. They're not men who are starved for sex. That's not why men rape. That's not the point, in any case. And again, that's need to understand sexual narcissism, which is playing an enormous role in what's going on right now. Not just all these men who are sexual narcissists, but the fact that we're all being groomed into sexual narcissism, and women are being groomed into masochism. Women are absolutely being groomed into acting like the fuck dolls of pornography. That is, again, another end goal, is for women to totally empty themselves of humanity so that men can project onto them and use them and turn them into literal objects. In any case, and I don't even begin to see how we can have any kind of liberated sexuality or any fun at all in the midst of this. These people are, the people that rain on our parade. They are the Debbie Downers. They are the fun killers, not feminists. Women cannot engage in any kind of free sexuality as long as this is going on. It is too dangerous for us. In any case, they are the buzzkills. These men, the amount of vetting that women have to do to find a partner who will actually care about their pleasure and who will not hurt them. In any case, obsessive rapists. What does that mean to be an obsessive rapist? It means when you rape people because they turn down specific acts. So they're usually obsessed with anal and oral rape. I should have definitely given a trigger warning to this. I'm sorry. They're usually obsessed with those, particularly. Why? Because they see them in porn and because their partners are uncomfortable with constantly providing those things, or maybe even at all providing those things. That's why. There's an entire category of rapists that is based on pornography. And so essentially, during, my aunt's time of free love, they began bringing women with them to these pornography theater houses to just show how liberated they were. And here she is talking about how she's no prude. She knows, it's fine that men talk about those things, and it's liberating. And this is a woman who thinks of herself as a feminist and who's a famous civil rights activist, in fact. And saying such things as, well, and when I was a young woman, we couldn't even have an abortion. So you should feel lucky. And again, I think this is in the United States. We're an incredibly conservative country. So the left really needs the alt-right to exist so that their centrism, their fiscal centrism looks in any way like neoliberalism looks in any way like it could actually be left-wing. They need them, right? Just like these misogynists need us to be constantly fighting for our bodily autonomy, because then the slight, the fact that the left is on the side of having abortion, of women being able to have an elective abortion, the fact that the left is on the side of that, we essentially cannot go with the right as a result of that. And there's a kind of, you should feel lucky that we're giving you your rights at all. And so there's a very, very low bar that's going on here. And this whole sex positivity thing is simply, again, the logical outcome of what won. What won was not the civil rights movement, or that's not what was remembered by history. What won was not the women's liberation movement. That's not what was remembered by history. What won was this free love movement and the way that it was forever in some way wedded to civil rights movements. And there is a reason I'm talking about all of this, because it has to do with the mass hysteria that's going on right now. It was all kind of wedded to these civil rights movements, as if free love had anything to do with the hard work that those people were doing, and as if it was not an entirely libertine movement. I won't even say hedonistic, because even the hedonists had their limits. No, it's these libertines, right? And they wedded that. They successfully, using branding, pornographers were able to wed that to the civil rights movement, as if the two have anything in common, when in reality they don't. And this is part of the disingenuous warping of class-based analysis. Again, the creation of cis, as if that's some kind of axis of privilege, in order to gaslight us that there is some kind of class-based analysis having to do with gender ideology. There isn't. This is a fully capitalist ideology. Okay, so, and it comes out of this libertinism. And again, it's cyclical. There's always, every 50 years or so, we have to deal with this bullshit. And this is not to say that I'm against sexuality. I don't think what they're calling sexuality is sexuality. Women being masochistic, men being sadistic, or flipping that on its head for kicks, and having some female doms and male subs. This idea of violence and sex, none of that is the slightest bit transgressive in any way, shape, or form. Thinking that sex should have something to do with affection and respect is transgressive. And they're kidding themselves if they think otherwise. My God. And again, it's simply because there's a complete lack of critical thinking about the ideals of the right and the left. The right was not really about courtly love or respect. That's a veneer. It was really about benevolent sexism, right? The idea that women need to be taken care of, and that also women need to stay in their place. And if they do, then they will get their patriarchal rewards of being white knighted and taken care of. It's a kind of protection racket, essentially, right? Whereas on the left, they push back against that, and they call that puritanical. And so, there's this belief that so-called vanilla sex is in some way related to conservative patriarchal values, and so therefore it is liberating to promote violent sex. And this is just a complete lack of insight into class-based analysis, or the understanding that the left or liberal values actually have very little to do with the left. And there was a wedding of liberal values to the left at a certain point as well, which an unholy matrimony, essentially. The same thing that happened with the free love movement being wedded to the civil rights movement. There was an unholy matrimony that happened at a certain point, but leftism has always been about class-based analysis and the idea that we need to have some radical changes to the way that we look at equality in society, and the way that we interact with each other as a community, and that we need to push for egalitarianism, right? Whereas liberalism has actually always been more related to libertinism, which is to say sexual libertarianism. That's what it is. It's a free-for-all. It's a men's sexual rights movement. It has never, ever been less misogynistic than the right. And again, this goes back to the time of the witch trials and is really worth finding out about feminist history in order to understand that. These ideas are no way progressive and they're no way new. They're cyclical. They're two different ideas about how to own women. Exactly as Andrea Dworkin said, the right thinks that women should be private property and the left thinks that women should be public property. These things have been around for a long time. Therefore, the left is not the real left. She said the left cannot have their whores and their politics too. And she is absolutely correct. And apparently, since that time, it's quite clear that they have chosen their whores over their politics. And this is Andrea Dworkin herself was a woman who was exploited in prostitution, so that's why she used that word. Okay. So talking about what's going on right now, the pushing for this is it's not transgressive. It's right in line with the cyclical nature of these men's sexual rights movements that are disguised as liberation of women. At least here in the 20th and 21st century, they have been, right? Okay, so there was this laughter epidemic. There was an epidemic of psychosomatic illness that broke out also in 1962. There's so many. If you just look through these entries about all these psychogenic illnesses, back in the Middle Ages, there were many times of dancing hysteria. Groups of people that would just start dancing, and more people would come along and see them dancing and be sucked into the dancing. And people would die of dehydration and would, dance themselves to death. There's many examples of that. And then there's examples of this happening rather than being in kind of physical manifestations of illness or dancing or laughter. There's many kind of mass panics or hysterias, and we've seen this even recently, right? With the hysteria about the satanic witch trials. We've seen this recently with the recovered memory, and so on. And essentially, whenever these kind of things happen, they make it extremely hard for those going forward. There are people who have been abused who have recovered memory, and it's extremely hard now to get any of this stuff in court or to be able to tell what's real from what's false as a result of that whole craze. And so this is going to... What's happening now is going to damage a whole generation of people, and it's going to make it really, really difficult for trans people going forward to figure out what the best case for transgender medicine is. And at some point I'll do a podcast on my best case scenario of how we could figure this out, and on the idea on the axiom, or one of the axioms of the trans movement, which is that they don't want us to exist. At some point I'm going to do one about that. Okay, so talking more about mass illness here. So last time I was talking about mental illness, and I was talking about, how to understand differential diagnoses and all these different, and one of my points about mental illness too is all of these mood disorders and identity disorders and uncertainty, which especially identity uncertainty is so common to young people. All of them are also playing a role in both predator and victim here. And again, I'm really afraid of, and this young woman, Benji, who's a detransitioner, who, recently did this podcast with, what's his name? I think his last name is Boyce. Let's see. It's a guy who interviews people on YouTube. In any case, this guy did this interview with this young woman, Benji, and she's specifically talking about the mass gaslighting of female to male people who have dysphoria, or maybe butch lesbians who are being led down the garden path, as my Welsh mother would say. Who are confused and are trying to escape from misogyny and patriarchy. And here they're being told that they have male privilege. They need to shut up and listen to trans women. Most of these trans women are much older, and these are underage male to female girls. And they're being groomed, and they're being sexually abused, and they're being exposed to things that they're not ready for before they've ever even had sex or have any idea of sex or what it is. They know nothing about their own sexuality. And here they are being groomed. They're a captive population for these predatory men. And again, it's interesting to me how we're called transphobic. And I'm going to discuss there in a minute the meaning of a phobia. When we are women who understand male violence and grooming and how it works and can see what's going on here. And yes, it's gaslighting to be told that we cannot see that this is going on here, and that in fact we are bigots who are making these people feel unsafe in the world. Okay, so let's take a look at also groupthink and collective narcissism. So I talked a little bit about how some women I think it's extremely flattering when a man, I think there's a lot of women who like to do makeup on men and there's a lot of women who I think really wish that men would be more like women, to be honest with you. I think that there's a lot of women who wish that men would not make their experience out to be so alien from our own, and would not be so alienated from us by masculinity. And so what we think is going on, we don't understand that these men who are transitioning from paraphilia and who are really mentally ill, or who got way too into pornography, or who have a submission and humiliation fetish, and so on, they don't seem to understand that these guys are the epitome of masculinity. These are not men who are in any way rejecting. They are so addled by their, going this far with their kind of their sexual fantasies, many of which are deeply misogynistic, and which naturalize women's state as submissives, that they are actually acting this out themselves. And this is the height of misogyny. But I think a lot of women really want, this is why we also see so many, young male to females that are saying that they're gay, and they're really into slash fiction. Why? Because they are attracted to males, but they're not attracted, they're heterosexual, but they're not attracted to the way that straight males treat women. And so they would rather see some kind of more egalitarian relationships that they see presented more when it comes to men's sexual relationships with men than they do with men with women. They don't have any good, these kids are missing any good role models of male-female relationships. And so that's what they're, that's why they are in that way objectifying and fetishizing gay men as objects because of this desire, right? And so this desire to be seen as a person by the men that desire them, the way that they assume would happen with gay men. And I would say that probably doesn't always happen in gay men because of the way male sexuality is so warped under patriarchy. There's social encouragement of the kind of worst tendencies. And I think that there's a lot of sexual abuse and also heteronormativity in the gay community. So I think even that is naive. But I think that that's a lot of a lot of women are making this kind of slash fiction, right? And so that's might be why it's a little bit naive. In any case, so I want to talk, about, so these women, why these women think that, these men are transitioning because they love women, because they identify with women. They think that these are the kind of men who would be most likely to be a man who really understands women and sees women as people and cares about women. And so they're like, I am all for this, men who want to become women, because these are men who care about us. I really think that that's a big part of what's going on here, that as well as the fact that women are totally socialized in order to prostrate themselves before men, in order to award men, to shower men with love and to support them in everything they do, and to put men in front of women. The whole world is socialized that way, as we can see, because right now we are putting men's feelings above male feelings above female material reality. That's what we're doing. We're putting male feelings above female safety and female opportunity in the world. We're not talking about, male safety or male opportunity. That is not actually what's going on here at all. This is about male's feelings and need for validation above female safety and opportunity. All of these shelters that have been defunded, despite the fact that there is absolutely no epidemic of violence against trans people at all. There's an epidemic of violence against women. There is no epidemic of violence against trans people. And I'm going to do at some point something about that as well, because I used to think it was mean to bring up the fact that these statistics are false. Well, that sounds kind of mean, but now I realize someone pointed out that they're making these trans people feel very afraid, and it's an alienation tactic, and it's a kind of cult tactic. And I realized, I heard of this trans person who had done their own research and then found out that these statistics were false and was floored, and was like, I walked around thinking I was in danger all the time. So actually, I think it's important to talk about the fact that these statistics are false. But it's women who are in danger. And so, defunding women's shelters to give money to trans shelters when there's no epidemic of violence against trans people, and when trans people comprise such a small percentage of the population, is madness. And women's shelters have been defunded not for not accepting trans people, but for having single-sex services. So, for example, they will accept transgender women, but they will keep them in the same housing with other transgender women. Or they'll accept gay men and keep them in housing with gay men. Because they understand the need for single-sex spaces for women that are recovering from male violence. Because male bodies are male bodies. There's an understanding of that, of the way that's triggering to women who have just been beaten and raped by men, but who with male bodies, who use their penises as a weapon. So it would be triggering to women even if this was the kindest trans woman on earth who still had their penis. Much less if you had one of these guys who is doing this for purposes of sexual fixation, who may be also struggling with mental illness and may display some kind of threatening behaviors, which has already happened at shelters, of these men walking around with erections or masturbating in front of women, or staring at them in the shower areas and so on. These are things that are already happening in shelters. And because of the whole sex positivity and kink positivity movement, when they complain to staff, when women complain to staff, they're told that they are being Puritan. They're being puritanical. Who cares if your bunkmate with a penis is masturbating in the next bed? As if we have, not only as if that's, a form of sexual harassment, but as if that's also not highly threatening to women who have experienced sexual violence and know how men can, resort to sexual violence at the drop of a hat at any given opportunity. And this is the given opportunity. So, yes, it's unbelievable that this is happening. So these women's shelters are being defunded because of that, and it's absolutely disgusting. But the women that are going along with this, they're going along with this not only because they've been taught to center men, but also I think because they truly believe. They do not know that some of these men epitomize male privilege, male entitlement, and male sexual narcissism. So that's part of what's going on here, I think. I talked about that last time. But I want to talk this time a little bit about groupthink. What is groupthink? It's a psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome. This is quite clearly what is happening right now. It's extremely annoying for all of us that know what's going to happen to point out what a disaster this is going to be in practice. And that is the point with trying to get ourselves heard politically, and yet it is being totally dismissed. Feminists are not even being heard. There's a media blackout on this. And again, this has to do with power on high. And people out there that still think that these are just the most vulnerable people who just want to pee, I don't understand why they think that this movement has entirely captured institutions all over the world. And they don't think that's odd. I mean, here we've got women. We've been fighting for millennia. And it wasn't until 100 years ago we even got the vote. And we're not even, and that's in, developed countries. Some countries have just barely gotten votes for women. And there's still mass violence all over the world against women. And there are more missing women in the world that are missing to sex-selective abortion and to female infanticide in countries like India and China than were killed in all the wars. Than all the people killed in all the wars of the 20th century. Do we talk about that? And the fact that is definitely based on sex? Did they, allow these girls to be born and grow up and say that they really identified as boys? No. This was based on sex. Oh, Jesus. In any case, we are going to see what's going to happen with these policies. And it's amazing how nobody's listening right now. And it's because of, anybody should be skeptical because of the amount of money, that's how quickly this has captured all of our institutions. This is coming from on high. There's a very specific reason for this that we should, and here's the thing. The difference between a conspiracy theory and reality is that a conspiracy theory does not have any evidence behind this. All of the evidence of what's going on here is all out in the open, except for it's just not being publicized. But, it's not like they're even, if you look, it's not like they're bothering to cover their tracks. And I recommend anyone check out Jennifer Bilek, Bilek, her blog, The 11th Hour, because she follows the money on this. So collective narcissism in social psychology is a tendency to exaggerate the positive image and importance of a group the individual belongs to. The group may be defined by religion, social class, race, political stance, language, nationality, employment status, education level, cultural values, or any other in-group. While the classic definition of narcissism focuses on the individual, collective narcissism extends this concept to similarly excessively high opinions of a person's social group and suggests that a group can function as a narcissistic entity. That is what is happening right now. It's not just the trans rights movement. The entire liberal left is functioning as a narcissistic entity. That is why we have purity politics. If you dissent on a single issue, you can be, in the case of these women who are longtime leftists, who are saying, wait a second, we want to talk about sex-based rights and protections. They are being turfed and feathered because of a dissent over this one issue, despite agreeing on everything else. That's what purity politics are, right? And that's because the truth is, and that they don't want you to know, is that they do not have any radical ideas at all. The liberal left, the neoliberal left, is firmly capitalist. They are just your kinder masters. That's it. There's nothing really more complicated about that. They're not radical in any way, shape, or form. And the thing about feminism, real feminism, is that it is. What radical feminists want to do is get rid of the sex industry, $1 billion industry, and what many men feel is their right to have exist. They believe there should be a subclass of women like me. And again, I'm really highly aware of how close I was to being, I am the demographic of women who ends up in prostitution. I am among the demographic of women who ends up homeless, who ends up in prison, who ends up in pornography. And I didn't, because of radical feminism. And so this is what these women need. They need radical feminism. And, the entire world seems to be okay with having this subclass of women. The entire world. And we can't blame the women that are in it for defending it. I mean, essentially, and it's the same way we can't blame these young people that are being led down the garden path and told that transition is their best way and go through all of these procedures. Can you imagine the pain of trying to understand what had happened to you and how you have been so misled by society? How did they allow this to happen? Where were, as Glinner says, as Kira Bell asks, where the hell were the adults? What were they doing? And I have to say this about my own upbringing. Where were the adults? Why did they think it was okay that these things were happening to me? Why did they think that that was okay? Why did they think it was okay that there was an entire generation of people that were suffering the results of this poisonous ideology that got started, unfortunately, alongside actual civil rights movements? It got started in the 60s and 70s. Why do they think that's okay? I mean, really, it came out of the Beat movement, and the Beat movement was championing a lot of early kind of queer theory ideas. All of these things were kind of brewing at the same time and just went in little directions. You can follow them like a branching tree. It's not that difficult, if you study history, to understand how this happened. You might not know all the particular actors or events, although I'm sure you could find out if you really did a lot of research. But it's not that difficult to kind of understand what happened overall, and how it is that queer theory and the people that were, pushing for the normalization of pedophilia first tried to attach themselves to the gay rights movement, were kicked out by that movement, how it is that they continue to push this through queer theory, and how it is that they got back into the LGBT, and how it is that they are related to this whole movement, which is essentially a libertine movement that's all about, and we're starting. And the thing is, they genuinely believed that I think that the end goal here is both to normalize transhumanism as well as the erasure of sex, and the way the effects this has on the female sex be damned, or on the male sex, although it's going to disproportionately impact the female sex. But all of that just be damned, right? It doesn't matter. In this utopian fantasy or vision, and from their perspective. From mine, it's dystopian. So it's a project to get rid of sex, but it's also a project to normalize everything under the sun, including what we would now call sexual abuse. Just normalize all of that, including pedophilia and so on. And meanwhile, you have feminists that are fighting back against this. This is why I think it's hilarious that France, they're trying to call transgender ideology a Western import, when in fact France still has no age of consent law. So a 5-year-old who is raped has to go and testify in court that they did not consent. And civil servants can rape young girls that are suffering from fits over and over and over and over again with no consequences. That's what's going on in France, the country in which they think they have, so normalized rape. As anyone who's ever read Michel Foucault or Judith Butler can see, they have normalized rape. As anyone who has ever read queer theorists who argue that stigma is the problem here, and that women have more dignity than being presumed to have been in any way traumatized by something like a male penis. It's incredibly infuriating to me. As someone who understands that denial is not psychologically healthy, and who also has not been allowed to speak about her own experiences. I really hate, people putting these words in my mouth. And Jane Clare Jones is fantastic and has done a lot of writing about this, about how it's about time that we understand rape to be that rape to be a type of torture. It's about time that we understand this to be sexual terrorism of women. And it's about time that we understand that women are human beings and that this has an enormous effect on us. And that we would like to be able to have that acknowledged as a human rights violation. And that acknowledgement that it is a human rights violation that all countries in the world are participating in, and that we are doing absolutely nothing about this epidemic of sexual violence against women. That acknowledgement would, be a really good first step and would really make a lot of women like me feel really good. It is not the opposite. It is not insulting to us to imply that we have been traumatized. Okay, so that's collective narcissism, and we can definitely see that happening right now, because part of the democratic principles of leftism is that we are all allowed to debate. Yes, and that's not happening right now. So that's the collective narcissism that's going on. And the groupthink and the mass hysteria. Yes, and there's been a lot of people who have been writing about how right now, essentially, if you Google any of these things, groupthink, and trans ideology, or mass hysteria and trans ideology, there's quite a few psychiatrists that are writing about these things. So I encourage everybody to look those things up. Another thing right now is that, having talked a lot about mental illness, there's a lot of psychiatrists right now that are talking about how psychiatric diagnosis is scientifically meaningless. So there actually is quite a lot of debate right now. And they're saying this because they're saying there's too much overlap for them to be able to identify discrete, that is to say, discrete, distinct mental disorders. So, because there's nothing discrete about these trans activists. We all know they have mental disorders. In the discreet sense. They are not discrete in any sense. Okay, so, yes, this is all good. I am fully aware of the way that social sciences often fail to meet actual methodology when it comes to the scientific method. They fail to live up to scientific standards of proper practice. I'm aware of that. That's why there's constant, discussion about this. The reason I'm talking about this too is because the DSM removing, dysphoria as a mental illness and rebranding it as gender identity disorder, and in many ways, let's see, DSM and trans. They have the DSM, where transgender is no longer a diagnosis. So gender identity disorder was renamed to the DSM-5 gender dysphoria, and they actually dropped the former term describing what was going on. Let's see, hold on. Similar to the new definition, let's see. Okay. An earlier change occurred in 2013 when gender identity disorder was dropped from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5th edition, DSM-5, the U.S. Psychiatry's Bible for diagnosing mental illness. I like the use of the term Bible there. A healthy amount of skepticism. A new condition called gender dysphoria was added to diagnose and treat those transgender individuals who felt distress at the mismatch between their identities and their bodies. The new diagnosis recognized that a mismatch between one's birth gender and identity was not necessarily pathological, notes pediatric endocrinologist Norman Spack, founder of the gender clinic at Boston Children's Hospital. It shifted the emphasis and treatment from fixing a disorder to resolving distress over the mismatch. Yes. I kind of understand that, but if resolving this distress over the mismatch is only going to be through affirmative care, that's the problem. You would not give affirmative care to any other type of mental illness, and that's the problem with declassifying it, because affirmative care is not the best course of action here. It should be considered to be a last resort, and we should be actually truthfully talking about mental health and physical health outcomes of transition. Spack compares the DSM-5's new definition as similar in effect to its 1973 declassification of homosexuality as a mental illness. So, as they say about that, although gay people certainly knew they were not sick, he says the move did have an effect. It has allowed the gay population in the U.S. an opportunity to pursue their life on their own terms. Being gay is not a mental illness. Whereas it is the definition of an illness to have such a strong dislike for your body that you feel the need to have surgical and hormonal intervention, medical treatment for that. You are so deeply distressed by your dysmorphia and dysphoria that you want to undertake this kind of treatment. That is the definition of a pathology. It is causing you problems in your life. It is causing you deep distress. And many of the ways that we see these people acting toward others is also pathological. It's not because there are many comorbidities with mental illness. That is the entire point here. It is not at all the same as being gay. And a lot of gay people have tried to say this, and I've tried to explain the business reasons behind why the T and the Q were tacked on to the LGB, when they are actually not only not related, but in some ways fundamentally opposed. Because now what you have is a lot of trenders, right? Straight people who are identifying as queer because they think it's boring to be straight. And then you have all these people that have dysphoria who are demanding that gay people sleep with them, even though that is not their sexual orientation, which is extremely homophobic. I would say in the true definition of a phobia as being an irrational fear. That's homophobic. They have an irrational fear of the fact that these people actually have a sexual orientation based on sex because it threatens their sense of identity, and that's an irrational fear. So that's homophobia. And that's what's going on, and it's actually antithetical to what the gay movement was trying to accomplish, which was to normalize same-sex attraction. To normalize attraction to the genitals of the same sex, not gender. This is not about gender at all. Now they're being told that they must accept people who identify as that sex, which is the opposite of normalizing same-sex attraction. It's, all this whole cotton ceiling rhetoric in which trans women, which is to say straight males who identify as women, are trying to get into lesbians' underwear and calling that the cotton ceiling, which is an absolutely disgusting appropriation of the term glass ceiling, talking about how women are not allowed to get past certain levels in business and politics. It just shows that men's priorities in this case it's not about recognition in business or politics or fighting for parity in housing or in employment. Their civil rights struggle is getting inside of lesbians' underwear. That's the cotton ceiling. How offensive that is, and the fact that people can't even see that is just a little bit mind-blowing. But those people, they are rebranding corrective rape as lesbian bigotry. So the male corrective rape of females is being rebranded as the bigotry of lesbians, and lesbians are being hounded out of public life. They're being hounded out of their own communities, and it is disgusting. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk a little bit more about these. Okay, so I wanted to talk also about, so my point about how you cannot necessarily diagnose someone. There's a lot of discussion within psychiatry about diagnosis based on symptoms. To me, that is a little bit moot. To me, that's actually quite similar to the discussion about gender, whether or not gender is nature or nurture, or if there's any of it that may not be socially constructed. To me, that's actually a little bit moot, because it doesn't matter if male violence is entirely socially constructed or not. The point is that it's destructive, right? And so we know we're a very plastic species. We know that we can raise people to behave in ways that might go counter to their nature, that are either more anti or pro-social, right? People are able to be raised in lots of different ways. That's why, in a sense, from the madness of civilization, I see a lot of tribal societies as being kind of control groups of the way things can be. You have societies in which it's clear that pedophiles founded the society, and there's hatred and fear of women and grooming of young boys for sex. And then you have societies that are more gender egalitarian than any in the world, in which fathers spend almost exactly 50% of the time with their children, and women are involved in all the same tasks that men are. So there's all different types of societies, which is really, really interesting. You can see how much the mythology of a culture, the socialization, the people who were the elders of the culture, who began it, how it gets recreated, whatever this mythology is, their cultural history, their norms, how they get recreated and passed down. It's super interesting to look at other societies that way and kind of see them as a control group. And so in talking about psychiatry, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter whether or not you call something mental illness or not. What matters is this something that is pro-social or anti-social? Oh, and again, that moot point that I was talking about with gender, it doesn't really matter to the extent to which it's nature or nurture. The point is that we can socialize people differently. A lot of it is noticing these kind of small differences between men and women, and then just compounding the hell out of them. Let's just go full-on extremist with those, and train men to be extra aggressive and train women to be extra self-sacrificing, and let's just, really lean into that. Whereas what we could have done instead is teach, boys how to have empathy for others, and teach girls how to be a little more assertive. There's no reason that we can't balance any natural urges with pro-social behavior the way that we, educate children as they grow up. And similarly, I kind of see the psychiatric point as being a bit of a moot point as well. It doesn't really matter how you label these things, what you say this illness is. What matters are the behaviors here. And are they pro-social or are they anti-social behaviors? And to me, that's what matters. And I think that mentally ill people need to be taught that they need to have pro-social behaviors. This is something we all have to work on. At the same time, absolutely we can have a civil rights movement in which we say the rest of society needs to stop shaming people who have mental illnesses. I mean, I need to be able to say, right now I'm having something go on because of a medication issue, so I need to, take a little time off work the way I would if I had any other illness. I need to be able to say that, and yet I have to say that in a large corporation under cover of going through these representatives who negotiate with my job so that I don't have to actually tell them I have a mental illness, to protect me so they don't know what condition I actually have. That should not actually be necessary. There shouldn't be such stigma. Just because I have a mood disorder does not mean I'm going to murder anybody. And again, there needs to be this kind of understanding of the difference between people who are male and female that have mental illnesses, and of the different ways that these mental illnesses manifest. There's just, we're all kind of in the dark on that. It's not something people really learn much about unless they go looking. All they learn are stereotypes. We tend to function in broad stereotypes. Our brains categorize and classify, and we're not, again, as I will always say, we're not naturally that rational as beings. And this is why it's necessary to kind of look at all different sides of the situation as they're occurring. And I feel like I'm doing that with regard to the trans movement, because I know that there are a lot of people that are genuinely struggling and have dysphoria, or struggling because of the society that is really breeding this into them. And I would like these people to have the best outcomes. My point is that these are not the best outcomes for them either. Creating these identities, of course you're just creating a sunk cost fallacy. There's no way that they could go back on this after a certain point. And this is why they are indoctrinating children. This is why I would agree that it's a kind of grooming. It's because they need trans children for their validation of these adult trans people. They need trans children to exist. And they don't care that it's a form of conversion therapy, that they're turning gay people into trans people. They don't care. They don't care about that. They don't care that it's homophobic. They don't care that it's hurting women. They don't care that it's hurting children. They need to have the trans children to prop up their identity. Okay, so we sort of have to look at the behaviors here and what's going on. And this is why I feel like I am really kind of an expert in this, because I can see these behaviors. I've given a lot of chances to a lot of different mentally ill people. I've known a lot of mentally ill people. I myself have mental illness. I can see how mental illness would predispose someone to being confused about these issues or to be seeking attention. People get so much attention by being members of these groups. All that women like me get accused of, all that women like me get if we come out about our histories is accused of attention seeking. There's really no social capital in being a rape survivor. Yes, but there's a lot of social capital in being trans right now. So I can easily see why a lot of people with mental illnesses would be attracted to this, both in terms of finding a community that goes along with this, that groupthink and does all this kind of love bombing, and the rest of the world accepting this and having all these people from on high, and essentially it's a way for mentally ill people to be able to feel like they actually are being paid attention to and people care about them. But it's all in the service of this ulterior motive, because otherwise, why aren't we just having a civil rights movement for the mentally ill? We're not. Just like women's liberation didn't really go anywhere. It makes people uncomfortable, and it also threatens the status quo too much, because if we talk about the rights of the mentally ill, what we're talking about is the way in which they are not fit for a capitalist society that is exploiting all of us. That's a little bit too close to the bone. It's a little bit too close to home. Same thing if feminists actually discuss if wanting to get rid of the sex industry. Absolutely not. Capitalists can't have that. And all of the other things that feminists want to have happen, they would just require too much restructuring of society. So it's actually a real threat, unlike transgender ideology, which not only isn't a real threat, but is part of this kind of techno-capitalist utopic vision. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to look at, right now, the definition of phobia. Let's look at the definition of phobia and get a definition that is the dictionary definition: an extreme or irrational fear or aversion to something. Okay, so that's phobia, which I was already aware. I just wanted to read the dictionary definition. Merriam-Webster defines it as an exaggerated, usually inexplicable and illogical fear of a particular object, class of objects, or situation. A persistent, excessive, unrealistic fear of an object, person, animal, activity, or situation. It is a type of anxiety disorder, Harvard Health says. These are phobias. And so to say transphobia is a misnomer. It is not a phobia to be. It is realistic to be scared of what's happening. You're telling women first of all, and you're training girls. And I'm going to do a segment about language and why and the whole pronouns are rohypnol, and about why training girls that men can be women if they say so. And then telling female to male confused adolescents that they have male privilege, how this could backfire, and how what we're seeing is a whole generation of young girls being groomed. But we see a whole generation of young girls being groomed anyway. So what we have with the trans movement is we have a whole generation of gender nonconforming young girls being groomed and abused. Some of the most vulnerable people, right? But we also have that through the regular liberal feminist sex positivity movement and pornography. We have a whole generation of young girls being groomed into performing for their boyfriends, pornographically performing for their boyfriends. So it's not like that's anything unusual. As a society right now, we're just kind of turning a blind eye to all of this. It's just that in that case, what you have is the grooming by oftentimes much older men of these very young, gender-confused, oftentimes homosexual or bisexual young women. So it makes sense to be scared of what's happening here. It makes sense, especially for women who understand the lengths to which some men can go for their obsessive sexuality, to be really afraid of this. It makes sense to be afraid of some of the red flag walking behavior of some of these people who identify as women. It makes sense to be afraid of having these men of having male sexual offenders in women's prisons. It makes sense to be afraid of having males allowed into women's domestic violence shelters. It makes sense to be afraid of having unisex restrooms and changing rooms. Anyone who understands male sexual violence and the fact that it isn't going away, and if anything, is getting worse because of pornography, and who understands that this is real and has done any actual research about this, or had any actual experience with this, rather than seeing it as a soundbite that they can blame on Puritanism. They understand that this is actually a public health crisis right now related to sexuality, and that it is something that we should be afraid of. If we care at all about the well-being of other people, including, our children and our nieces and our nephews and their friends, and, all of the people, the people who will grow up and be the generation that's taking care of us when we're elderly, all of the young people that are growing up right now, there's something to be afraid of. This is scary. It's a scary ideology, and it's harming people. So it's not an irrational fear. We have to start pushing back against use of transphobia, and perhaps come up with our own term to describe our rational fear of what's going on here. And I'm just going to, talk about the term pervert, because oftentimes, and so what I want to talk about is the bigotry against trans people. So right now, what is being considered bigotry against trans people is women talking about the stuff I'm talking about right now. So pointing out the sexual abuses, pointing out the abuse of children, pointing out the abuse of gay people, pointing out these things, pointing out the conflict of interest, pointing out the gaslighting and erasure of women, pointing out those things. And again, I'm definitely going to talk about language at some point and do a segment about language with about women's language being taken from us, and about the dehumanization of women in the name of this movement. And again, this is a movement that has more political support behind it than feminism has ever had. And so radical feminists were able to build all of these shelters for women and get all this grassroots support for women on our own organizing. And I say on our own because I identify as being part of that group, but I've actually never done any of that organizing. And I have so much praise for those women who have, and I hope I can give back in some way, even a tiny bit of the percentage that they have. I would like to do what some of these extremely courageous and extremely persevering women, dedicated women, have done. And women did this with no support. Later they were able to get some government support when these things that, shelters and programs that they opened worked, but it was all grassroots organizing. And right now, transgender ideology has the most, way more money in the world, and they're not able to go out and make third spaces for trans people. Why? Because it's not about the safety of trans people. It's about their getting validation from women. It's about forcing acceptance on women. It's about breaking women's boundaries. It's about breaking women down. That's what it's about. It's never been about the safety of trans people or the acceptance of trans people. And by acceptance, I mean accepting that there are, people who want to present as the opposite sex and that it's okay to be gender nonconforming. I don't mean accepting that they actually are. None of us are under any obligation to do that. We do not have to accept that. Okay. Just like nobody has to date me if they don't want to date someone with a mental illness. And I do tell people that I have bipolar disorder in order for them to not only be able to be supportive, but to understand that it's something I have to deal with in my life. If they don't want to date me, that's fine. I can understand that, maybe not wanting to deal with something that might be a little difficult. And I don't want to date someone who's not willing to date me. And so that's what it is to, accept someone. It's to accept that they are different and whether or not you want to take that difference on. We cannot accept that they are what they say they are. And you cannot force people, you cannot compel people's thoughts or speech. And people cannot actually change sex. And, the transition does not get rid of the way other people see you and does not get rid of the privilege which is, or the oppression which has been bestowed upon you. Those things are not erased. Just because you declare that you are who you say you are. In any case, so what we call transphobia is people saying that they don't believe in what is essentially religious ideology. There is absolutely no evidence that there is such a thing as a transgender person, rather than a person who is simply gender non-conforming. And because our society is so rigidly gendered because of misogyny and homophobia, and patriarchy, and we're so, both misogyny and homophobia are artifacts of patriarchy, and we are so committed to keeping people in their places in order to keep women in their place, that these people who are gender non-conforming and don't fit into these boxes, not always, but oftentimes gay, I think a lot of gender nonconforming women are not gay, but grow up to simply be feminist, which is interesting. And it makes me wonder how many straight gender nonconforming men there are as well. And how there may be, since there's more acceptance, or at least when I was growing up, of the tomboy and the straight gender nonconforming women, that since there's less or there historically was less acceptance of gender nonconforming men, or the fact that they might be straight, there's even more kind of pressure toward masculinity on men, because we haven't begun to really touch those power structures. So it's like we budged a little bit for women. So the whole thing of feminism, it's like we're asking males within this very patriarchal power structure in which this pecking order that they police themselves, to give us a little leeway. But we haven't asked them to work on themselves at all. And they have to work on themselves in order to actually begin to address patriarchy, instead of just turning women into copies of men, essentially. And that's, kind of what's happening here. And I think, again, that we can't begin to sort of talk about the way that this has affected both male and female sexuality, and our relationships with each other. The fact that there's a strain of feminism that sees equality rather than equity feminism, that sees women becoming like men as being the way to liberation or to equality. And so we haven't asked men to really reckon with masculinity. And so there may be a good deal of gender nonconforming straight male people that simply because of the extreme pressures on men for masculinity, are kind of, I would say, gender washed out of that. The way that women who are, there's a lot of pressure as well, and there was a lot of pressure on me past the time of prepubescence, once I entered adolescence, to be feminine. Before that it was kind of okay, but after that it was not. And I think probably a lot of women can relate to that. There was a lot of pressure on me to perform femininity after adolescence. And so, I'm sure there's an immense amount of pressure on men who are gender nonconforming but straight. And so we might not even see that category of men. And some of them might now think they're non-binary or even women because of the fact that they are heterosocial as well as heterosexual, because we live in a very strangely homosocial, for men, homosocial, heterosexual, homosocial and homonormative kind of, and heteronormative society, which is to say, men are supposed to prioritize their relationships with other men and how other men see them to their relationships with women. Because if they have friendships with women and care about how women see them, they're white knights, they're cucks, they're simps, and so on, right? They're gullible fools that are catering to women, who are, seeing women as people, listening to what women have to say. My God, what will happen next? And so men who sort of eschew masculinity and prefer to make friends with women have long been accused of being gay for preferring the company of women, which is rather extraordinary if you think about it. And I think some of those men might be kind of gender confused as well. So what you're seeing happening right now, what's being called bigotry, is this idea that you don't necessarily believe that there's always been this idea of the trans person, rather than that it is a gender non-conforming person that is reacting to the sexism and the homophobia and the rigidity of patriarchy. We can all agree on that, absolutely. But the idea that it actually makes you the opposite sex, and that's something that can be real. If you don't believe in that, you are a bigot. And if you raise concerns, you are a bigot. And if you talk about how even if you did believe in that, we definitely need to talk about women's sex-based rights and how this is affecting women if you try to transition into an oppressed group, and in that sense to sort of to take on the identity when you out of your oppressor class, how you need to be, at the very least, if you expect acceptance, which you should have no expectation of, but if you do, at the very least, you should be as considerate and sensitive to their position as possible, instead of steamrolling your way over them. The extremely masculine behaviors of these people really give them away. I mean, the first thing that you'd want to do if you want to be a woman, is just drop your sense of entitlement at the door. women are it's amazing to me that women have never even managed, I'm not going to say women, I'm going to say our society is so sexist we can't even get sex to be a protected class. And we cannot even have hate crimes based on sex because we'd spend all our time prosecuting hate crimes then. We have so normalized the violence against women that we can't understand that it's based on women's belonging to this certain class of people. It's just part of the air that we breathe. So, because of this, these males are getting more consideration because they are males. That's the point. And it's male people who are driving this movement. I mean, if you look at politics and if you look at business, it's largely trans women, most of them late transitioners, who are being lauded as these female figureheads and role models. And you don't see trans men represented very much anywhere. And you definitely don't see trans men represented much if they're not, unless they are sort of attack dogs for the trans movement as well. And you see trans men in the movement getting gaslit and talked over. And their experience as females is being completely discounted. So you're just seeing, again, no queering is going on here. There's nothing queer about men talking over women. There's absolutely nothing queer about men assaulting women, about men ignoring women, about men taking women less seriously, not listening to women's ideas, about men being elevated above women, about men getting all the political spots and scholarships and awards and attention. That is patriarchal to the core for male people to get those and female people to be ignored unless they're having kids. Trans men having babies is the biggest the reason that they make the news. So, it's just recreating these patriarchal patterns. There's nothing transgressive. There's nothing revolutionary going on here at all. It's pretty obvious, but that is what's considered to be bigotry, and that is what's considered to be transphobia. They think simply not agreeing with them and being able to see what is going on is transphobia. And so when you see all these people talking about the transphobia they face all the time, what they are talking about is the people that don't agree with them and the people that want to argue with them or disagree with them about any single point. And again, collective narcissism. That's what's going on here. It's a narcissistic entity. Collective narcissism. That's what they're talking about. When they talk about transphobia, they're not talking about right-wingers or the violence they face from those people. Most of them, I would say that those that had to get away from families that were ultra-conservative and didn't accept them, maybe have experienced some of that like gay people would for these gender non-conforming people who come out as trans. However, when they're living in liberal areas, all they're getting is validation, and there's not this huge attack on trans people. As I mentioned, the statistics don't back that up. The murder rate is higher for people who are not trans, whether male or female. The highest is non-trans male on male, and then non-trans male on female, and then trans people in terms of murder rate. So the murder rate's much higher for women, and it's much higher for men. There's not this epidemic. So what is it that they're talking about when they're talking about bigotry? They're talking about people disagreeing with them. And I know that there's been a lot of people who have looked at whether or not you can call transgender ideology a cult. And I kind of think that, the whole, the pushing of, the umbrella of sex positivity and queer theory and the pushing of kink and trans ideology, that there's a cultish vibe and sex positivity. There's a cultish vibe there to all of that. And a lot of the recruitment tactics and the way that they act and the grooming and so on, they definitely fit a lot of the different markers of being a cult. I'm interested in why the kind of what is the collective madness of accepting them. Part of that is because the kind of silent institutional capture that's happening behind the scenes of all of our, all women boards, all of our, especially women's spaces are all being infiltrated and captured. All of our politics, all of our institutions, and so on, and they're disseminating all this literature, and it's being packaged as going along with gay rights, and again, it's all just like really, really smart branding. So I think that's part of why. And there's the groupthink and the mass psychosis, and there's the fear of speaking out, and the certainty, and there's the preference falsification, where you're certain that you're the only one who has these, the only one who's seeing this. And that you must be wrong. There must be something that you're not quite getting yet. So I think that's part of what's happening. There's a mass hysteria and a mass psychosis that's going on. And I think that within the transgender ideology itself, there's a collective narcissism. They're all love-bombing each other. And there's a cult-like mentality that's happening. And at some point I'll go into the characteristics of cults and the work of someone like Jen Smith, who was a part of Synanon, a cult which I'm very familiar with, and how it's sort of related. Yes, that's definitely something that's going on. So I just wanted to talk about like this idea of transphobia, and I'm definitely going to talk about like this idea of you don't want us to exist, and what it is actually that radical feminists do want to see happen at another point. But I just wanted in this to talk about a bit more about mental illness, about transphobia, about collective narcissism, and about mass hysteria. And overall, I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the end, and so what they're calling bigotry is just people disagreeing, right? And people fighting for their rights. And in the end, what we need to remember is that they are the bigoted ones. They are bigoted against gay people, and they are bigoted against women. And they are perfectly happy to see us lose our jobs and our homes and our livelihoods and our reputations, and even to see us tortured or tormented or die because we raise these questions and these concerns. They are perfectly happy to see these things happen. And these mass hysterias are always accompany mass scapegoating that takes place before you have some kind of genocide that is committed. I'm not saying that there's going to be a genocide. I'm saying that the rhetoric surrounding this is the type of rhetoric that does lead to violence against a certain group of people. The dehumanizing of anyone, but particularly women, who speak up against this. The rape threats, the death threats, the very graphic threats of violence, the threats of mass violence, and then the doxing, the smearing, the no platforming, the firing, the persecution. All of this is being supported. And you have, companies like Amazon and Twitter, which are allowing people to spread these things, including violent messages and violent, pornography, and rape threats and death threats and so on, but which are banning women for life from the public square. What this is essentially, it's the modern day public square, for saying such things as biology is real, or only women have cervixes, and other such things as that, or for asking questions that people don't want to answer. They're being banned for life. And that is being called bigotry. But we need to remember that these are the bigots. These people are the bigots. They are the ones who want to harm women. They are the ones who want to harm us. And some of them are laughing at us. And they're laughing at the women that go along with it. And they think they're putting one over on us. There are people going along with it for all these reasons of mass hysteria, preference falsification, groupthink, collective narcissism that are manifesting right now in the culture. We need to remember that it's not, and my point again here, after going through all of this stuff about mental illness, because that's contributing so much to this. It's essentially, it is the mentally ill people who are being exploited in the movement, and it's mentally ill people who are, it's the disordered who are driving the movement. And then it's a kind of mass psychosis or hysteria that has been engineered, socially engineered, which is also going along with this. So this was to talk about kind of how people treat the mentally ill. And I was thinking about this, and you don't want to have stigmatization. And I think, it's interesting to me that there's still so much stigma against the mentally ill that they, and for all their talk about don't be ableist, there's so much stigma against the mentally ill that they were just cheering on the victory of being removed from the DSM, even though it's not in the best interest of these people who have these intense dysphorias and dysmorphias. It is not in their best interest. It is in their best interest to be able to resolve what is happening in order to be able to live within their body without having to sign themselves up for a lifetime of crippling pain and medicalization. It is not in their best interest to have affirmative care. It is not in their best interest to go along with the delusion that there have always been transgendered children and transgender people throughout history, rather than gender non-conforming people who have been persecuted for that. And that the best reality would not be all of us living in our sex bodies and behaving however we want, as long as it doesn't, infringe on others' rights. This is not in their best interest. And it's actually harming a lot of them that need real, at the end, it's only palliative care for a hopeless case. That's what it, was supposed to be. It's not supposed to be some kind of pioneering, cutting edge, oh God, that sounds like a horrible pun, of humanity. It's not supposed to be that. It's not supposed to be, a place where psychopaths can try to refine their surgical techniques in order to play God, to try to, recreate humans in the image that they desire. That's not in their best interest. We're supposed to do no harm. And our first duty of care is to try to help these people find a way to reconcile, as indeed we know that upwards of 80% of transgender identifying children will naturally just grow out of it and will come to terms with it as they get older and are able to reconcile the fact that they're gender nonconforming and the social kind of the negative social attention that they receive for that, the stigmatization. So it's not good to stigmatize, yes, but it's also not. And so that's my point. Like, that's why it's a win that it was taken out of the DSM, because it's so stigmatized. It's not a win for trans people to not call it a mental illness. It's not. It's not going to actually help them, because we're pointing out that it's a pathology that affects them and it affects others, and that they have a responsibility to others as well as themselves. That's kind of the point. It's not actually helping them. And that's because of stigma, that they think it's a win to be taken out of the DSM, instead of just come to terms with the fact that it is a mental illness that someone might have been predisposed to, but it's been bred out of the culture. Okay, so there's that. And then there's also the other side of it is enabling. Enabling does not help the mentally ill, and that's the point of taking it out of the DSM. It's not actually helping them. It's enabling. It does not help the mentally ill. You must. And again, it's the black and white way of looking at things. It's, for example, the whole idea that because the Puritans shamed people for sex, and we know that they really made people feel terrible about themselves and dirty, and like sex was something dirty rather than something natural. So since they said sex was bad and we know it had bad results, therefore all sex is good. That is a logical fallacy, and that is black and white thinking. So it's the same kind of thing. Just because it's bad to stigmatize mental illness. And the weird thing is that they're not even saying it's bad to stigmatize mental illness, and that's why we're taking this out of the DSM, Because just saying something's not a mental illness doesn't stop stigma at all. It's a backwards way of looking at things. And that's not what they're saying. They're not saying trans people are mentally ill and we shouldn't be stigmatizing mental illness. Instead, they're saying trans people are not mentally ill. And they don't even say the second part. Because what they're doing is they're reinforcing the fact that everyone thinks it's so terrible to have a mental illness, that you cannot, it's so stigmatized, right? And so they're enabling their mental illness by denying it. And they're not helping them. And enabling is not helping either. Enabling is the twin face of stigmatizing. What you need is people to understand, but also require some responsibility from the person who has behaviors that are harmful to themselves and also to society, to others. And that has nothing to do with either stigmatizing or enabling. And the point is, right now, as a society, there's a mass enabling of these people and their delusions. And these delusions can be harmful to themselves and others. And that's the point. And it wasn't a harm when it was just a couple outliers. And it wasn't a harm when it was just a few homosexual transsexuals who just could not reconcile living in their sex body. And it was just much less of a harm then. And, you know, it was much better for AGP men when they were in the closet. You know, maybe we could say, okay, let's not pathologize men who want to dress as women, but we do need to say that since it's a sexual paraphilia, they need to find a community that's okay with this and go do it there. And not actually say that they are women. And that might help them to practice their hobby in a way that's actually pro-social. You know, making friends and so on, other people that are like them, and they get to get that out of their system. And, you know, not make their entire life about it. That actually would have maybe been helpful for some of these men who have now been convinced that in fact that they are women. And some of them are just grifters, some of them are just trolls and frauds, some of them are just incredibly unhinged, and some of them just want attention from women. You know, there's all these sort of things going on, but there's a mass enabling of the mental illness because people are unwilling to say that they are mentally ill, and to say that we need to stop stigmatizing the mentally ill, but at the same time not enable their behaviors either. So, you know, this is all born of stigma. And it's very ableist. It's very ableist of them whenever they insist there's no component of mental illness to this. And I always counter with, what's wrong with mental illness? I thought you weren't ableist. And people with mental illness actually do suffer quite a bit as a result. But others suffer also, and that's the point. You don't let people who are mentally ill off the hook just because they are also discriminated against by society. But in this case, I would say that the mass enabling going on right now, this is not discrimination by society. This is exploitation. It is medical exploitation. And I am disgusted with all of our institutions, and with the cowardice of our journalists, and with the cowardice of our political commentators, and with the cowardice of our activists. And that is the end of this podcast.